Mr. Okon's adoptees never
I want
returned
to
to
watch
the
this video.
orphanage homes,
How this
not
baby,
even to
the girl I
visit.
don't mind
Neither
now.
did they mix up with the everyday kids.
When I was a baby,
They were
I
never
wasn't
seen
babying like
outside his
this.
house,
Watch
not in
this
school,
video. Watch this
church,
video.
or within the community. Mr. Okon was a seasoned political figure in the town of Utuma. Popular for his generosity and goodwill towards women and children, he had the heart of the people. Although rich and influential, he had the most humble of characters. Despite all his wealth, he had very few properties to his name, the mansion in which he lived in, and the 2 cars he drove. When asked why he invested in few properties, Mr. Okon would always say, "To invest in humanity is much more peaceful than investing in properties. When I sleep, my mind does not think and worry about my houses in Abuja, Port Harcourt, or overseas, because I don't have houses there. Rather, my mind recalls the smiles I've put on people's faces, and my heart is gladdened." This marveled people, for they had not seen a man who cared less for vanities as much as he did. Mr. Okon's generosity and simplicity was interpreted in different ways by people. For many, he was just nothing but a good man who wanted to make a difference using his position in society, but for some, he was the typical politician who knew how to use disguised generosity to win the people. He had contested 3 times for the local government chairman position and won. There was always a wide margin between him and his opponent. He was undeniably the man of the people for the people. He was loved by a large number of people. He was admired by both young and old, and was used as an example by parents for their young children. Go to school, read your book so you can be like Mr. Okon. Mr. Okon loved education. He was very passionate about it and invested so much in it. He sponsored many brilliant children to school and set up free extra lessons for those whose parents could not afford them. While he paid teachers to take them, he was often seen in some of those classes teaching the children. The children loved him and enjoyed being around him. They were always eager to hear him talk, as he was so gentle and soft-spoken, unlike their teachers, who seemed to be possessed with the spirit of impatience. Another notable good deed of Mr. Okon was his contribution to orphanages. He was most popular among orphanage homes in Utuma. In fact, it's safe to say, he had been to and contributed positively to all the orphanage homes in the town. He was known for celebrating his birthdays and other seasonal events such as Christmas in orphanage homes. Every year's Children's Day, he threw elaborate parties, specially for children in orphanage homes. He visited them often and always went with lots of gifts. Each time he visited, he would play with the children like he was one of them. Despite his glaring love for children, Mr. Okon had none of his own. At his age, people wondered why he was not married. He had money, he had character and charisma, so what could possibly be the reason he was without a wife? Rumors had it that he had nothing in between his legs, hence his inability to get with a woman, not to talk of reproducing. This perhaps fueled his love for children. He occasionally adopted children from orphanage homes and took them as his own. During one of his birthday celebrations, he adopted 5-year-old Elora, who was brought into the home at the age of 2 after her parents died from a gas explosion. She was the most excited when he came for her, and the smile on her face when they were leaving reassured the orphans that there was hope of a life beyond the house. Then there was Sabina, the 7-year-old girl who came in the house at 0 months old. Her single mother had died during her birth and she was brought to the house. Sabina was notably intelligent with dreams. Before her departure, she had always talked about how she wanted to become a nurse so she could save dying people. Abigail was also one of the little girls he had adopted. Abigail was 9 when he took her. She was the oldest of his adoptees. She had a very quiet demeanor and spoke little words. Her father's sister brought her to the house when she was 7, after her mother's demise 3 years after her father's. Mr. Okon's adoptees never returned to the orphanage homes, not even to visit. Neither did they mix up with the everyday kids. They were never seen outside his house. not in school, church, or within the community. It was rumored that he usually sent them overseas after some time. Many people said he had a house in Europe where he sent his adopted children to. It was believed he had hired a white woman who took care of them while they schooled there. Being adopted by Mr. Okon was the dream of every child in the orphanage homes, and they prayed secretly for the day it would be their turn. One day, Mrs. Udowo, the children's mistress at his care orphanage home, was attending to the children when she was informed by the gatekeeper that she had a visitor. She went outside to receive the visitor, a tall, slender, dark-skinned man in his early 40s. She had ushered him to her office where they sat and talked. Apparently, the visitor, who was by name Mr. Felix, was the father of Sabina, one of the girls whom the philanthropic politician had adopted. Mr. Felix had narrated how he was unaware that the demised mother of his daughter was pregnant after their one-night encounter, and only got to find out almost 10 years later through her friend. He had requested for his daughter and volunteered to carry out a DNA test on her to prove beyond doubt she was his. Mrs. Udowo, who informed him about his daughter's adoption 2 years ago, promised to inform her foster parents and fix a date for them to discuss. Mr. Okon was the most elated when he heard the news in Mrs. Udowo's office. "That's amazing! Sabina will be so happy!" he exclaimed. He, however, expressed concern about Sabina's willingness to meet her father, as that would mean her returning from overseas, and she most likely might not want to. For the first time, it was heard from his mouth that he sent the children he adopted abroad. Whether Sabina was to come back or remain there was entirely up to the young man that had come to claim her. A meeting was fixed, and the trio had come together for the first time to discuss. Mr. Felix and Mr. Okon had exchanged pleasantries and a handshake before the meeting proceeded. Mr. Felix narrated his story again to Mr. Okon and reinstated his wish to take his daughter. "I understand that at this point all you want is to have your child," Mr. Okon began after his narration. "But I think it will destabilize the girl, as she has already gotten quite comfortable with living overseas. She currently goes to the best school and has everything at her disposal. You know, Sabina is an intelligent girl. She is very driven and dedicated, and I think the environment she is in now is what she needs to, materialize her potential." He had concluded, hoping he had convinced the young man to leave things the way they are. Mr. Felix insisted on wanting to at least meet his daughter and initiated that he would let her return if she wanted to afterwards. Mr. Okon, who was visibly unhappy with his stance, quickly made it known that he would not sponsor her return once she came back, adding that it would weigh down his finances. At the end of the day, it was agreed that the girl should return to meet her father. Mr. Okon promised to begin the paperwork immediately and have her return as soon as possible. The gentleman had left Mrs. Udowo's office chit-chatting and parted ways with a cordial handshake. Days later, Mr. Okon was set to meet with Mrs. Udowo to brief her about his progress on bringing Sabina back. As he drove through the streets of Utuma, a strange emptiness loomed everywhere. Only a handful of people were seen outside, and few vehicles plied the road. He wondered if there was something happening that he was unaware of, or everyone packed their bags and deserted the town while he slept. He got to the orphanage home and headed straight to Mrs. Udowo's office. She had a very wary look on her face and talked like she was recovering from a trauma. "There's no need, just let the girl be," she said immediately. Mr. Okon began talking. "The gentleman that came to claim her was reportedly shot dead in his hotel room last night," she declared. Mr. Okon's eyes nearly popped out of their sockets. He looked shocked and perplexed about the news. "This is tragic," he exclaimed. Mrs. Udowo said nothing, but just shook her head sideways. "Does the police have any information on the killer?" he asked. "Nothing," Mrs. Udowo answered. "That's serious. Insecurity is becoming a normalcy in our society today. I'll make sure I get to the bottom of this," Mr. Okon noted before leaving. Days later, the shock that came with the incident slowly faded and normalcy returned to Utuma town. Rumors surrounding the tragic death had it that Mr. Felix belonged to a cult group and was ambushed and killed by a rival cult group. Months later, it became a forgotten tale, and the people of Utuma went about their daily lives like before. One person that never forgot the incident was Mrs. Udowo. She tried to convince herself to believe it was really a cult rival, but the more she tried, the more her instincts rejected the allegation. She thought Mr. Felix looked too calm and gentle to be in a cult, especially for his age. Something was not adding up about his death, and her instincts hitting on it, and she became curious. Sometime after, Mrs. Udowo called a meeting of all mistresses in orphanage homes within Utuma. In the meeting, they had discussed the children's welfare and other things, which included Mr. Okon's contributions to the orphanages. They discussed the children he had adopted from their care and how long they had been in his care. Mrs. Udowo posed the question, "How many of you have heard from these children since he took them?" They all exchanged glances for some time before returning their gaze to her. Nobody could say objectively that she had heard from anyone since their departure. This frightened Mrs. Udowo, and she feared they had been careless with their children. She encouraged them to ask after the children any time they came in contact with Mr. Okon. The next time Mr. Okon came visiting at the orphanage, Mrs. Udowo called him into her office and after a brief chit-chat asked about Sabina and Abigail, the two girls he adopted from her orphanage. He assured her that they were fine and threw in little details about them. "Chai," Mrs. Udowo had begun. "I've missed my children. Oh, I'd really love to speak with them at least. Can you put a call across to them? Let me just speak to them briefly." The question visibly threw Mr. Okon off balance, as such a request had never been made to him, before he stammered for a bit before finding an answer. "I don't think they will be available now. You know the time difference between here and there. They might be in school right now. Not to worry. I will look for the best time and schedule a call," he answered. "Where exactly are they, sir?" Mrs. Udowo asked with keen curiosity. "You know you never told us you took them overseas," she added. "I didn't really feel it was necessary," Mr. Okon responded. "You know, I prefer to do some of these things without attention being directed towards me." "It's okay, sir. I understand. I want to really appreciate you for all you've done for my children. We're grateful, sir," Mrs. Udowo greeted. After her brief exchange with Mr. Okon, Mrs. Udowo remained troubled. Something in his hesitation, the way he stammered when she asked to speak to the children, deepened her unease. Though he had been a known philanthropist for years, there was a sense of growing suspicion she couldn't shake off. The faces of Sabina, Abigail, and the other children haunted her thoughts. Were they truly safe, happy, and thriving overseas? Or was something darker at play? One evening, as Mrs. Udowo sat with the other orphanage mistresses, the discussion turned once again to Mr. Okon's adoptions. She voiced her concern. "Something's not right. None of us have heard from these children. They seem to vanish once they leave with him. It doesn't sit well with me." The room fell silent as the women exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that they shared her concerns, but were afraid to speak out against such a prominent figure in Utuma. Finally, the mistress of St. Mary's Orphanage broke the silence. "There might be a way to know what's really going on," she said softly. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Udowo asked, her heart quickening. "We've had new technology donated recently, a small undetectable camera and microphone. If we can slip it onto one of the children before she's adopted, we can keep an eye on her and learn the truth." The room buzzed with nervous excitement. It was a risky plan, but they knew they had to act. Days later, the opportunity presented itself when Mr. Okon visited Home Care Orphanage Home, requesting to adopt another child. He was drawn to a quiet, unassuming girl named Tessie, who had lost both her parents to illness. Tessie, just 9 years old, had large, inquisitive eyes that followed Mr. Okon as he spoke to her with gentle words. After completing the formalities, he was ready to take her home. Unknown to Mr. Okon, Tessie had been carefully prepared. The orphanage mistresses had sewn a tiny camera into a piece of jewelry Tessie wore, a delicate pendant around her neck. Inside her clothes, a small microphone was discreetly fastened, with strict instructions not to mention it to anyone, especially Mr. Okon. The first few days at Mr. Okon's house were normal. Tessie reported that he was kind and attentive, treating her like a father would. He provided her with good food, new clothes, and a comfortable room. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Tessie's nights, however, were marked by strict rules. She was not allowed to leave her room after dark, and the doors to other parts of the mansion were always locked. Each night, Tessie would carefully place the pendant with the camera on her bedside table, capturing the quiet emptiness of her room. At first, there was nothing unusual to report, and Mrs. Udawo and her colleagues began to wonder if their fears had been misplaced. That was until the night Tessie woke up to a soft creak at her bedroom door. The footage from Tessie's camera the following morning sent shockwaves through the orphanage mistresses. Mrs. Udawo, sitting in her office with trembling hands, watched in horror as Mr. Okon quietly entered Tessie's room in the dead of night. His demeanor was entirely different from the warm gentleman he portrayed during the day. His face was cold and expressionless as he approached the sleeping girl. Then, with a quick movement, he covered her mouth, muffling her cries as he did the unthinkable. Mrs. Udawo gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She couldn't bring herself to watch the rest of the footage, but her colleague next to her did. They watched in growing horror as the night unfolded. Mr. Okon cutting off Tessie's head with terrifying precision, placing her organs into containers and storing them in a hidden freezer inside an unused room in his mansion. He removed her head and carried it to another room, a chamber filled with sinister objects, ritualistic tools, candles, and jars. The mistresses sat in stunned silence, barely able to breathe as the video ended. "We need to act now," Mrs. Udawo finally said, her voice breaking. "We can't let this monster continue." That same evening, the women gathered the strongest men in Utuma, trusted locals who had no allegiance to Mr. Okon. Armed with rage and a plan, they stormed his mansion just before midnight. Mr. Okon, startled from his sleep, ran outside, confused by the sudden noise. He barely had time to react before the men dragged him out into the open. "What is the meaning of this?" he shouted, struggling against their grip. "I've done nothing wrong." Mrs. Udawo stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "You know exactly why we're here, you devil," she spat, holding up the small camera, still playing the gruesome footage of his atrocities. As the video played, the crowd gasped in disbelief, some recoiling in horror. The truth of what Mr. Okon had done was now undeniable. He had not been sending the children overseas. He had been murdering them in cold blood, harvesting their organs and using their bodies for rituals. No, this isn't what it looks like," Mr. Okon stammered, backing away. But the mob was no longer listening. Fueled by rage and disgust, they descended upon him, beating him mercilessly. His screams pierced the night as he begged for mercy, but none was given. Through swollen lips and a broken jaw, Mr. Okon finally confessed. I didn't want to do it," he sobbed. "I was desperate. I was poor and powerless until I met someone. He introduced me to a secret society. They promised me wealth, power, and the love of the people. All I had to do was sacrifice the children. We trade their organs for money and use their head for rituals to attract love and admiration from people." He paused, blood dripping from his mouth. "I was the one that killed Mr. Felix. He was going to ruin everything for me when he came and started requesting for his daughter." His words only fueled the mob's anger, and before you know it, they doused him with gasoline and set him ablaze. As the flames engulfed him, the town of Utuma watched, horrified, as the man they had once revered as a hero was reduced to ashes, a monster in the guise of a saint. In the aftermath of Mr. Okon's demise, the people of Utuma struggled to comprehend the horrors that had unfolded. His once legendary generosity was now seen in a new light. The orphanages mourned for the lost children, especially Sabina, Abigail, and the others who had disappeared under his care. Normalcy gradually returned to Utuma after several weeks, but the imprint of the horror that occurred was never erased, not even in years to come.